Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Bush Institute and IBMF at Syracuse University for creating this environment to be able to have this very important conversation on transition. As a former recruiter who's walked the streets of America, I totally understand the connection between transition and recruiting in an all-volunteer military. And so for love of country, this is the right thing to do for those that serve, and we as a panel are honored to begin. So our panel one, is how do we deliver a successful transition? National leaders from the public, private, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors will discuss conditions, elements, and systems to set the conditions for a successful transition and reintegration from military service to civilian life. Federal, state, and local government play a critical role. However, the scale and scope of post-9/11 veteran transition and reintegration is such that the private, philanthropic, and nonprofit sector must provide tools, resources, programs, case management, and referral networks that are beyond the capacity of government. This panel will provide an overview of the veteran-serving nonprofit space and identify why a focus on the issue of improving outcomes for these nonprofits is important. We're going to begin with Colonel Jim Isenhower. Jim, all sectors have an important role to play, and your office recently published an important paper, After the Sea of Goodwill, a collective approach to veteran reintegration, highlighting this theme. As you developed the After the Sea of Goodwill white paper, what did you discover as the essential elements of an effective collective impact model?
Thanks, Wayne, and thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks especially to all those folks here at the Bush Institute for putting such a wonderful program on. We appreciate the emphasis. And on behalf of the chairman of the Joint Force, I send his regards to you and thanks for your investment in veterans and their families. Wayne, to your question, what we wrote in that white paper is a blinding flash of the obvious. It's not original thought. But after looking at this field for about a year and a half, we realized that we're already trending towards a level of collaboration that we think can be expedited. And we argue, as you noted, if it's led by the private sector, who we think is better positioned. We really argue three things. The first is that there needs to be vertical integration among functions. We've got the capacity to do that. We're just not doing it to our full potential. As an example, if we were just to address employment, the function of employment, and look at those great community service providers like Charlotte Bridge Home or Augusta Warrior Project, or you already heard about Rally Point 6 from General Corelli, they do fantastic work at the local level, but their tactical experience is really something that should interest state legislators, state directors of Veterans Affairs, and those who are directing the secretaries of the state departments of labor. And it can really inform what happens at the state level in terms of licensing and credentialing or tax incentive to encourage veterans to come to a state or encourage employers to hire them. Likewise, even up at the national level, there are wonderful organizations and government organizations who are pursuing initiatives that could benefit from that tactical level experience. As an example, Rosie Cloud has developed with her team the Veterans Employment Center, which is a fantastic portal, a single government portal where employers can go to find veterans looking for jobs. She may be interested, and her team may be interested in what happens at the local level based off employment trends to maybe modify or continue to refine the interface. An organization like the Department of Defense can benefit from that experience too as we look to consistently modify and update our transition curriculum. All of that's valuable feedback, even in the private sector, the wonderful work that's being done by Bank of America and research funding for veteran challenges, or JP Morgan Chase and the 100,000 Jobs Coalition. They may modify where they place funds or how they focus on investment and what they teach members of their consortium. Vertical integration is necessary in each of those functions. The second piece we argued was that there needs to be horizontal collaboration or horizontal integration, where you've got functions that don't necessarily complement each other, but they do have some duplicative effort on the fringes, from financial literacy to legal challenges all the way through any other function you might imagine a veteran or a military family member may experience. We've got the capacity to do that. The third point is that in and of itself, and that's the IT capacity. The internet is nearly ubiquitous and almost everyone has access to it. And in a day when we have that ability, we ought to be able to craft an integrated referral network system where all of those entities, the 40,000 plus, are linked, both public and privately, to create a no wrong door approach or a no wrong door capacity for our country. I think the good news is we're trending there. We could do it this afternoon. We just need to get to work.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. I'd like to touch on the funding portion of your response and go to Stephanie. Stephanie, the scope of veteran transition is such that the government can't do it alone. The support from the nonprofit community is and has been essential to the task. Can you talk a bit about the role and responsibility of foundations and funders in aligning resources with expectations of outcomes for veterans and how funders do that most effectively?
Sure, thank you for having the opportunity to be here to talk about the role of the philanthropic funders. I think I'd like to first react to something that Miguel said while we were waiting backstage. I think I heard something about he who has the gold. So I suspect that for many of you, we're the sector that you think has the gold. So, but I want to disabuse you of the notion that I brought the bags of gold in the back room. So, but I'm happy to talk to you about how to connect with the foundation sector. So if I could sneak in a little commercial, I'd like to welcome and say hello to any of the council's members who are here. I know that there is a contingent of foundations here, and I would love to connect with you when we do our networking. So I think it's important to understand that the philanthropic sector it really is a stakeholder. It's a stakeholder in this work to try to help smooth these glide paths of veterans back into civilian life and into their communities. And I think that we know kind of intuitively that we have some national responsibility. I know the Council on Foundations, under the leadership of our CEO, Vicki Sproul, who unfortunately is not able to be here today. I know the people from New England and New York will have absolutely no sympathy, but that 6 inches of snow we had in Washington yesterday created some havoc with planes getting in and out and people getting actually out of their driveways and to the airport. So she was unfortunately unable to be here today. But we have made a commitment as a national organization, of which we have about 1,600 member organizations across the country, to really lift up what the issues are, what the challenges are, and also to help educate our sector about what these needs are, these very unique needs of the post 9/11 veterans. I think that we see our role as working with the nonprofit community. We're a funder of the nonprofit community. The health of the nonprofit community is very important to us. We also see ourselves as trying to lift up innovation as well and help nonprofits become more innovative, become more responsive, and really become more accountable for those outcomes that they are trying to reach. I would like to also say that there's another role for us in this resource discussion, and that really is our role as a stakeholder in shaping public policy and working with the public sector as well. There are a lot of lessons, I believe, that many of our veterans funders have to share with our public policy makers. I know we have a relationship with Jim and his team and share a lot of insights with each other and bounce things off of each other, trying to bring the learnings, the lessons that we have in the foundation sector to the public sector. We know we can fund things that the government can't fund as well. But the conundrum for us, and I know we're going to talk about this more today, has to do with who's out there doing the really solid work. You know, where is the effectiveness? And how do funders know? How do they wade through, you know, this plethora of all of these nonprofits that I think Miguel was referencing and that others will talk about? How do we know who's really doing the solid work? And that's where I think we continue to need help, both through the relationship with the public sector, with the research, the academic institutions. Mike is sitting up here. The work that Syracuse did in putting together these toolkits is going to be very invaluable, I think, for our sector to do that alignment.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. I'd like to bring JD into the conversation. JD, you lead one of the most well-known and iconic support organizations for our military. How has the USO focused efforts to serve the current veteran population?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Wayne. Again, thank the Bush Institute. And one thing I want to say up front is I expect to learn a lot myself here today. This is a great gathering of people who've got deep knowledge in this area. You might actually ask or start by asking, why is the USO even up here? You know, don't you guys kind of do Bob Hope and airport centers and things like that? And of course, our mantra at the USO has been always by their side, and we live that mantra by being there when they come into the service, all the way through the various transitions inside the service. And of course, also at that very critical transition at the end of service in a variety of different ways. Our core focus will continue to stay on the active duty, military, Guard, Reserve, their families. That is obviously, we have to stay true to that purpose. But part of that is also, we feel very strongly that we have a role to play in helping to create a more successful veteran, if you will. We're not a veterans organization. We don't have a veterans membership, but we do work with a lot of the folks that are out there. And obviously, one of the things we've done is we've built 3 really, I think, state-of-the-art centers for the wounded, ill, and injured at Belvoir, Bethesda, and Landstuhl, where we have been able to have, I think, a very positive impact in reinforcing programs that are being supported there by the government. But we've also invested in the last few years in 3 areas, largely with partners who are in this audience, many of them, in the employment area, as well as in building stronger families. We feel very passionately about the idea that a strong military relies on a strong family, and so having that helping to heal some of the problems like that were mentioned in the video, for example, that my husband came home, but he was different, and how do we deal with those kinds of issues? And then finally, in the sort of therapeutic area. So we have tried to be both a partner, to some degree, an investor, to some degree a mentor, and we have also learned a lot from those organizations. So the USO has been very involved. We see the critical space for us, and it's different for different organizations, is that time in transition just before they get out and just after they get out, because that's where we have the most contact with the men and women who are in the armed forces.
Thank you. Thank you, JD. I appreciate that. I'd like to now provide, since we're on this panel, we're talking, looking at it from a national level. I'd like to bring Jacob Harrell into this and give a perspective on this spectrum or this industry. Jacob, there are approximately 45,000 military serving nonprofits available to veterans and their families. That's a sea of goodwill that can be difficult to navigate. Many of these nonprofits are very small. Studies estimate that 80% generate less than 100% in annual revenue. Can you provide an overview of veteran-serving nonprofits and how this sector compares to nonprofits overall?
Absolutely, Wayne, and I'm thrilled to be here. So Guidestar is the largest source of information about nonprofits in the U.S. We have about 2.5 billion pieces of data on nonprofit organizations, ranging across environmental groups to homeless shelters, to organizations that are explicitly focused on serving veterans. And I think there's a very valuable two-way dialogue between the broader nonprofit sector and the specific experiences and goals within the veterans serving community. And I actually think the broader nonprofit sector has a lot to learn from conversations like this, that are a moment to take a pause and step back and try and understand an ecosystem of organizations and how they work together and how they could work together better. So broadly, there are about 2 million nonprofits in the US, and about 800,000 of those are what we think of as traditional charitable organizations or 501c3 nonprofits. And of that 2 million, about 46,000 explicitly identify as veterans serving organizations. although there are many others that serve veterans that don't necessarily have that as part of their central identity. It's interesting to note that of that 45,000, about 30,000 are local posts. They're VFWs or American Legions. The American Legion organizations make up 35% of that 46,000, and VFWs make up 22%. There's a huge range in size among these organizations. There are about 585 by our count that have more than $1 million in revenue per year, and about 62 that have more than $50 million a year in revenue. And many of them are new. About 10,000 of those 45,000 have been formed since September 11th. It's also interesting to look at the variety of different focus areas that they have. Within a focus on veterans as people, they view that through a number of different lenses. So among the 501c3 organizations, the traditional charities, I thought you'd be interested to hear some of these basic stats. So 915 of them focus on arts and culture. About 765 of them focus on education. There are 30 focused on the environment, working with veterans but through an environmental lens. 27 that work with veterans through an animal lens. 210 focused on health. 1,366 that are focused on human services. And then there's this broad, vague category called public or societal benefit that has about 2,500 organizations that are focused on veterans. So there's an immense amount of diversity. So when you look overall at this ecosystem of veteran-serving organizations, you see that it's a large ecosystem. It's quite diverse. It's relatively fragmented. And in comparison to the rest of the nonprofit sector, on average, the organizations are smaller and they're newer. So to me, that offers an opportunity for just this kind of conversation to think, how do we take this moment in history and ensure that this broad, diverse, big, but kind of new community of organizations operates at as high a level as possible. And then my hope is that lessons learned from that can then get transferred to other parts of the nonprofit community.
Staying in the nonprofit, on that nonprofit conversation, as a nonprofit leader, Stephanie, I'd like to ask on behalf of my peers out there leading nonprofits, what do we need to know and understand about funders?
Oh, well, where are the funders out there? Raise your hands. So you also want to be asking those people when you're networking. So help me out here. What do nonprofits need to know about funders? Well, I think it's important to understand that foundations and philanthropists have a mission, and mission really drives the work that they do. And part of the work that I do in Washington in trying to create the conditions and the climate for good partnerships between government and philanthropy is to really disabuse the notion in many quarters that foundations are like your local ATM, that you can kind of walk down to the corner and ask for some money and for the work that you are doing and walk away with a check. And I think probably for most of you who have been trying to work certainly with the foundation sector and the philanthropy community know it's not that easy. Our foundation sector really, no matter whether they're investing in community development or veterans support, really are looking for strong impact, are most of the time in it for a longer haul. Granted, the recession in 2008, it changed for all of us, certainly, and there was a lot of emergency funding, if you will, for sort of short-term needs, given what was happening with communities in the recession. But, for the long haul, I think funders are, it's safe to say, looking for some impact. And, the return, there's a return on the investment, but it's not your traditional bottom line, return of the corporate sector, but rather, foundations want to know what's happening with those individuals, the beneficiaries of this work, and how has the capacity of the nonprofit delivery system really been built, solidified, improved, certainly in communities, that there's community impact that's out there, knowing, especially in this arena, we're talking about transition to community. So there's a lot of impact on community when veterans are showing up in those communities and asking for services. And there's been a fair amount of pressure on community services, certainly since the recession, with all of the needs, what I call the garden variety needs that are out there, and then adding in the return of a large number of veterans into communities, then is also sort of stretching a lot of those systems who may not have cultural competence, to deal with veterans. So I think that what we want to do is we want to work in partnership, certainly with the nonprofit community, but we also need the nonprofit community, the service providers, to understand about our culture, certainly as funders, and to look at what our missions are and to help us achieve our missions as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that, Stephanie. And I'd like to stay on the impact portion and go to Jim and talk about collective impact from the role as far as the role from government perspective. How can collective impact better drive more efficient and more effective and enduring outcomes?
I think there's a couple of points that I'd like to make. And when we travel, one of the things we've seen, and the most effective examples of collaborative action and collective impact, there's always three things. There's always a convener. It doesn't have to be a politician. It's just somebody with some energy and drive and passion. There's got to be data, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, because it's fundamental to making a convincing case to your funders and ensuring that you can sustain your operations. And at the end of the day, there's also got to be commitment, and that requires asking people to help and to volunteer. Those three things are critical. But let me revisit data for a moment. One of the things that we are attracted to a national referral network for is that the potential it offers for data that can inform the field and help us determine or understand priorities from a demographic standpoint, from a social or cultural standpoint. We don't have that real well. Frankly, government doesn't do a great job of sharing data. And I know a lot of you out there will tell us that, but there are very necessary constraints, and the Privacy Act drives all of us crazy, but that's there for a reason, and we certainly wouldn't advocate for changing that. However, I think government can get better at releasing data more quickly, data in the aggregate where it doesn't violate privacy concerns, and subsequently inform what's happening at the local, state, and even the national level. On top of that, if we were to have, led by the private sector, a type of integrated referral network, imagine the potential there in weekly data pools that could tell us what the #1 demand is in Los Angeles County or the #1 concern in Chicago, and how quickly we could use that and incorporate that aggregate data that doesn't violate any privacy and turn it around to where we've got both a public set of data that may inform what we're doing and reconcile that with the private set of data, and in turn really redefine this field. One of the things when we travel we realize is that there's so many people who have wonderful desires and passions to help veterans and their families. And in many ways, though, they're shooting in the dark because they don't understand the specific needs in that community or their specific focus area. And so I think this would be critical to true collective impact, and that's finding ways to collect that data, analyze it very quickly on a short turn, and then incorporate that into determining where our priorities are, where there's duplicative effort, and how to eliminate that to provide the best services in rapid fashion.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Jim. I want to bring JD back into the conversation and talk a little bit more about what do you see as the connection or the relationship between large-scale national organizations and those in those communities that Jim just spoke of?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a two-way street. I mean, I think it's very much a two-way street, and it's not, it's not what can the large scales do for the small scales. It's actually how do they work together. Yeah. And I think, the small-scale organizations bring a number of things to the table that I think are really valuable. First of all, innovation. Not surprisingly, that's where a lot of the more innovative programs and techniques are developed. Secondly, local support, and you see them generate that local support in very tangible and sustainable ways. And then third, they bring a domain knowledge that sometimes the larger organization may or may not have developed, and it depends on obviously who we're talking about. But I think those are very, very valuable. But what are the problems that they then confront? And I think that's where some of the larger scale organizations like the USO can be helpful. For example, I talked earlier about the idea of sort of incubation, and I know the USO has tried to incubate programs in a sense through investment, sometimes monetary investment, but more than investment, through branding, through being able to utilize the brand of the USO, and there are other organizations that can also do that, and through joint program execution, so that one of the things that is important is makes us a little different than, let's say, the foundation world is we're actually out on the operational edge. We're doing stuff. We have an operating wing, if you will, and that allows us to really do the second thing that I think is needed, which is awareness of what's out there. So, for example, in our case, we touch the military community 8 million times a year. That's we have about 150 centers worldwide. We have over 30,000 volunteers. These are all opportunities not only for awareness of the programs that the smallers are bringing, but also an opportunity to provide, and the third thing, which is access to what they're doing in a way that is fairly integrated and tangible. We got a lot of work to do in that area, by the way, but I think that's an opportunity. And then the final one that I would spend the most time on really is scale. I think part of the things we've been struggling with in this space has been how do we scale up activities, but at the same time make them still effective and meaningful. And I think a combination between the smaller, more innovative, best of breed, best practices type organizations married together with some of the things that larger organizations can do in terms of resources, location, operational experience and the like can really help to find the way to scale up those most important things. But we're going to have to prioritize. We can't do it all, and we're going to have to figure out what are the most important things that the men and women and their families need.
Appreciate it. Thanks, JD. I want to bring Jacob back into, earlier we talked about those 45,000 veterans serving nonprofits. What can we do to help veterans navigate what can be quite overwhelming in that particular area when they're seeking assistance?
Well, I think we've got quite a bit of work to do on that front. It is very confusing. Colonel Isenhower talked about collective impact, and collective impact starts with collective purpose. And I think the nonprofit sector has to always remind itself that we are means to an end. We're not ends in and of ourselves. And that may mean that we're often referring a client or even a funder to someone else. That second one's kind of hard, but it's especially important. And so there's just a lot of work to be done to ensure on multiple levels that veterans are able to get to the service they need. There are a couple of concepts here that I think are worth noting. One is, and it's talked about in the research, is the idea of no wrong door. You enter organization A, and you're in search of job training. It turns out that organization A is focused on mental health services, but organization B across the street has job training. And how can we ensure that organization A, in a fluid way, shifts that veteran over to organization B? That requires a sense of collective purpose. And it also requires a sense of actually knowing what organization B is all about and what their processes are, even at a very high level. But I think if we bring that sense of collective purpose, we can begin to establish that. But there's also a need for infrastructure, an information system that makes it easier for that to happen. And Colonel Isenhower talked about Illinois joining forces. There are other examples. But we've got a lot of work to do to build online portals or other tools that can help make this process easier for veterans, not to mention all the other people that are served by nonprofits. But that requires a commitment on the part of nonprofit organizations to share their basic data and to act as if they're part of a broader community and not just an isolated organization. There's no single national portal that is playing this role right now. Hopefully we can build that over time. But there are organizations like Guidestar that can play a tiny bit of a role there, but we are not veteran-facing. We don't have an interface that's designed for the unique experience of veterans. And that's something that can be built at the state level, at the national level, at the local level, and you really need all of those. But I would say we've got some work ahead of us, and I think that could make a big difference, though. And I think it's urgent, because if we spend too long, then I think some people are going to throw their hands up and say it's all too confusing for me. I'm overwhelmed by these 46,000 organizations. And that's something that I hope that this conversation can help lay the groundwork for those sort of platforms and tools down the road.
Thank you. I want to actually follow up on the data portion. How can funders such as Stephanie and those that she represents, and veterans like myself and many of those out there in the audience, use data from Guidestar to make informed decisions?
So, I mean, there are a whole range of different, what we call use cases. So an individual donor may come to Guidestar looking for information about where to give. An individual organization may come to Guidestar looking for a partner. A journalist or a researcher may come to Guidestar trying to understand a field. And as I said, we have 2.5 billion pieces of data. There's a lot there. We have some work to do to make that data more and more accessible. And over the course of this year, we're completely redesigning our user interface. There's another piece to it, though, which is also sharing data. So most of the data we have comes from the tax forms that nonprofits file with the IRS. But we as a field have too long allowed our story to be told by a tax form. I mean, can you imagine telling your own story as a human being by your 1040? And yet we in the nonprofit sector somehow think that a 990 is going to tell the full complex story of nonprofits. And that's why another thing that we ask nonprofits to do is to come to Guidestar and share more data about your goals, your strategies, what's happened so far. And we've had 107,000 nonprofits do that so far. So we can begin to round out our understanding of nonprofits in a way that goes beyond just a tax form.
And Stephanie, where are the gaps for the funders?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of points here I'd like to make. I think it's important, before we can talk about sort of gaps, but we need to understand, I think, in the philanthropy sector, what it is that the government funds and what it doesn't fund. This goes to, I think, something that Jim was saying earlier. It's really hard to get that kind of aggregate data out of the government, trying to figure out what is it. And so it is, I think it's a good role for organizations like ours as a national association, is to bring the people who can tell that story. Yep. Because I know the Rosie Clouds who are here, and there are other folks, the Doug Carmens at the VA, and certainly people from Jim's office, but who can, we can put in front of the funding community to help funders understand what it is that the government does do. There is, I think this is probably a pretty universal conception across the country. It's not just limited to funders, but I think most Americans think that the government takes care of veterans, and by paying their tax dollars, they're taking care of veterans. And so we're learning that there's a whole different narrative that's going on, and it's a big job to educate the country. We all have to kind of work together to do that. So that's sort of a first point. I think it's very important also for the foundation sector that's not in this space, as we call it, funding in this space, to really understand the unique needs of the veterans, the post 9/11 veterans, and to really understand what that landscape is. And I do think that having the reports such as what the Bush Institute has done, and there's certainly a lot of reports out there that really lay this out so that people really understand kind of what the needs are of this particular cohort of veterans. Foundations don't typically operate programs themselves, so the information coming in from the nonprofit providers, all of this, these 40,000 that are out there, but it's very important for nonprofits, I think, to educate funders about what's missing in communities as well. And we need better kind of community strategies. If we're talking about successful reintegration, and engagement of all of the aspects and facets and institutions and communities, then we need to have a good community-wide strategy. And we've certainly seen some successes with some of our members, the San Antonio Foundation, certainly the San Diego Grant Makers, the Community Foundation in Lincoln, Nebraska, that's really working with the Adjutant General there and has put together a whole community program, if you will, for National Guard members. I mean, I think that's something, that's a piece that a lot of people don't, they kind of go like, oh my gosh, sure, the National Guard. People sort of think of people like Jim Isenhower wearing this, you know, nice fancy uniform and the pictures that we see on TV, but there's all of our neighbors who served in the National Guard in these conflicts. And so we have to kind of remind people about who's out there and what kind of needs that they have. I think we need to do more, certainly, in our sector. I'm going to get this data right, but just to put it into a bit of perspective, the total veterans grant making that we pulled out of the database at the Foundation Center, which is sort of our data collection agency, if you will, for the foundation sector. So from 2003 to 2013 was about $800 million, as $60 million in 2013. So considering that foundations gave about $50 billion in 2013 alone, we know we have a lot more to do, certainly in our sector, to get more funders interested in this work. They need to be better educated, certainly. And many foundations want to know what to do. But again, the landscape is not quite clear to them and who's doing what and how they should do that. We also need to strengthen ways in which our current funders, those who are in the veteran space, can help their peers who are not quite there. You know, we've got community foundations all over the country. There's about 750 community foundations in the United States. They're a really good resource and should be engaged in helping communities plan these strategies. So we have a job at the council to continue to educate and message to the community. And I think I'd just say, sort of to end, that we realize no one sector can solve this. I mean, we have to be working in collaboration, and we have to continue, and we're committed to trying to provide that platform that brings government and the nonprofit sector and the private sector together to really try to plan these collaborative strategies.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. And speaking of Jim and his impressive uniform that we have on stage, I'd like to talk to those that are still wearing the uniform. So in addition to attending TAPS, what else can service members do to prepare themselves to transition?
Thanks, Wayne. All of you know there's a very small refrain out there, I'm sure you've all heard it, that tends to victimize veterans and their families. And that's not meant, when I say that, to diminish any of the very serious challenges that some of us face. But at the end of the day, we're a reflection of society. And the proof is that we are contributing members to the communities, and we're civic assets. And one of the things that General Dempsey just recently signed with each of the Joint Chiefs was a letter that's going to go out across the Joint Force, reasserting what he is calling the call to continued service. There's historical precedence for this. We saw this right after World War II, during the drawdown then. And the message is very clear, and I'd ask all of you to profligate this. Post this in your places of business or whenever you're dealing with veterans. But in it, he and the Joint Chiefs remind all of the service members and their families that in thanking them for their service, they also have an obligation and a responsibility to continue to serve and to not fall victim to a refrain that may not apply to them. And in doing so, we hope that every one of them recognizes that they are still pivotal members of our community and our country. They can help chart the nation's destiny just like our forefathers, those who have come before us, those veteran generations before us did. And in fact, we need to set that same example of investing in our civilian community and the civilian sector, just like those who came before us did, so that we inspire others, the youth of America, to raise their hand and become members of the all-volunteer force. At the end of the day, transition and reintegration should be an individual responsibility. You've got to plan for that. You've got to take responsibility for it. And every veteran responds well to charges. They're used to that for their term of the service, to figure out what their task and purpose is, what the mission is, and to continue to move to accomplish that mission. And this is what the chairman and the Joint Chiefs are trying to do with this memo, and that's inspire them to continuing to serve their country once they've hung up the uniform. So I'd appreciate it if all of you take that. If you don't have a copy of the letter, let us know. Anybody in uniform here can probably help you. We've posted it on our webpage, and we're certainly willing to get you a hard copy.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Jim. So we're also to increase the degree of difficulty for moderating this panel. I'm also checking email, and we're live streaming, and I have some questions from around the world. So I'm gonna actually give this to each of the panelists. I'd like for each of you to weigh in. And the question reads: in the past few years, there have been a proliferation of nonprofit organizations claiming to provide services to our veterans and appealing to Americans for contributions. Possibly a few of these organizations have the ability to provide the meaningful help that is delivered in a cost-effective way to our vets. Do you agree that this has become an issue? And what can we do to address this situation? And we'll start with Jacob and work our way down.
So I like to talk about the elephant in the philanthropic room, just hiding somewhere under one of these chairs, I guess, which is that some nonprofits are better than other ones. And it's a truth that I think is intuitive, but it's one that we often aren't willing to say out loud because we want to respect the passion and desire that led people to start all these organizations. But it's a reality. Now, so we face a challenge to, one, ensure that those organizations that are truly high performing are raising the capital that they need. And two, those that aren't but could be good, or maybe even be great, are able to learn from each other. And that's where I think these sort of conversations and the right kind of information sharing, the right attitude of collective purpose can help us on both of those fronts begin to do a better job of ensuring that resources, attention, power are focused on fewer organizations. Now that said, it's also true that it's a flowering of democracy that we have 45,000 veterans nonprofits. That's a beautiful thing. And it represents the diverse, decentralized, grassroots passions of the American people. That's something we want to celebrate. But when it comes to resources, when it comes to attention, we do have an obligation to try and figure out how to do that well and how to align all these activities to create as much good as possible.
Thank you.
So I think it's actually very good that we're all here today and that the Bush Institute has kind of taken this on. This is a conversation that needs to be, I think, elevated and be one of the major conversations that's going on nationally. So it's a little dicey, it can be uncomfortable about whether these 45,000 democratic flowers that have blossomed okay, are all going to get watered, cultivated. And so maybe there's also in this, democratic narrative that you're talking about, there's some capitalism going on, and the market forces are going to come to bear too, and that may not be a bad thing. And it's always heartbreaking for the people who maybe have started a nonprofit when they can't find the funding anymore. I mean, I do get desperate phone calls probably almost every week, looking for funders in North Carolina and Texas and California and Rhode Island, where this is what we do. And I mean, you hear the passion all the time, I have to say. I mean, I'm just like, oh, if I had a checkbook, I'd be writing checks to everybody. But I think that we have to sort of let some of those market forces work. There's another uncomfortable word for nonprofits, and that's that merge word. But there may be, it may be necessary. And I don't look at it, I think I was talking to somebody about this last night, not so much the organization itself, but the talent. So if we begin to merge talent and bring talent together to really complement each other, then we may be able to get to some really good, comprehensive, and well-performing individual organizations.
Excellent. Thanks, Stephanie. JD?
Well, I think the elephant is now out from underneath the seat, which is a good thing. I absolutely think that there needs to be a conversation around this. It's a tough conversation. We deal with it in the context of programs that we support and the like. Obviously, we want to make sure that the people we're working with are doing good things, but that's not good enough, right? I mean, because it turns out of those 45,000, maybe there are a very small number, I want to believe, that are actually, kind of in it for some purpose that's not good. Most of them are. They're all doing good things. The question is that a sustainable model? And so, I think back to a story, which is so the USO stands for United Service Organizations. It does not stand for services, armed services. It was actually a 1941 industrial roll-up that was convened by the President of the United States at the time, who said, I'm going to take 6 organizations, I'm going to put them together, scale them up for the coming war. And he did that in February of 1941. Now, that's a very industrial age kind of way of dealing with it. But I do think, as to your point, we have to think about what are the models that we want, whether they be joint ventures of kinds, or some kind of cooperative partnerships, things like that, all the way up into the fact that possibly you want to have some kind of merger where you can really begin to get scale and not just in terms of output, but also in terms of cost, so you can reduce the cost to do these things. That then gives the funding community a lot of impact on one end and a lot of efficiency on the other end. So those are the things that I think about when I think about that problem.
So Jim, if you could address that also, not as necessarily government, but in your travels, you get to see, you have a very wide purview.
Yeah, members of government are always thrilled to answer that question. And I thank Miguel H. from Dallas, Texas, for submitting that online.
Is your lawyer here with you, Jim?
Oh, he's watching.
He's watching.
The reality is, I hope that came from a veteran, and that's, I'll just address it to veterans. If you're concerned about an organization to which you're going to donate your money, or an organization that you're going to ask services from, I just encourage you to talk to another veteran. I think we all trust each other. We've got this common identity. And in my travels and our experiences, veterans will tell you exactly what they think. And you're going to get some honest feedback. I think eventually I'd like to see the field have that type of consumer feedback mechanism that would really inform where the services are most effective. So for the veteran that asked that question, just talk to another veteran and ask, and do some of the research. You've heard some of the experts here tell you about how you can do that, and make the decision based off of some research, whether it be just through social contacts or some diligence you've pursued in researching some of the statistics and what they do and the services they provide.
Thanks, Jim. I'd like to, I was remiss earlier in my housekeeping duties, but we're actually able, the audience here is actually able to submit questions via the link at the Bush Center website. So if you'd like to, since Miguel has already submitted his, the rest, the other 349 can feel free to join in also. So in 15 seconds or less, I'm going to ask a question. This is from Yellow Ribbons Unite. If you could tell all military nonprofits to do one thing right now, what would it be? And we'll start again with Jacob, 15 seconds or less, and work our way down. One thing.
So to remember that it's about common or collective purpose, and that may mean that your organization has to step aside, has to merge, has to be acquired, because ultimately it's about the people and the communities and the ecosystems that nonprofits serve.
Thank you.
I think I would say tell your story, but make sure that that story is underpinned by data. I think it's a really important piece of the story. And the story, of course, needs to be about those who are benefiting from the service. It's not so much the organization itself, but what is the impact on who you are trying to serve, and try to really, I think, provide a clear picture about the work that's being done and then how it's being received by the beneficiaries.
Thank you. JD?
A little tangential, but I think something that the Bush Institute's clearly worried about is I think we need to speak more clearly to the civil-military divide. Because I think there's a lot of people out there who when they see our message, our narrative, they say, I'm really glad you're doing that. What we need them to say is, I want to be part of that. And I think we raise the boat of resources and awareness, and I think to do that, we have to talk more directly about what the role of our military is in our society, what it contributes to our prosperity and our freedom and those kinds of things, to get that message, to cement that message to the 99% that didn't serve.
Thanks. Thanks, JD. And Jim?
Build a no wrong door capacity. You don't have to be an expert at everything. Nobody expects you to, and I would argue that your services wouldn't be that effective if you tried to be. But if you're part of an integrated network that allows you to refer service members and their families to someone else who can help them with a different problem, we're all going to do very well to reintegrate these men and women back into our society and help them chart our country's destiny.
Thanks. Thanks, Jim. Once again, I'd like to thank the Bush Center for allowing us to be here to provide the platform for this conversation. I'd like to thank my esteemed panelists here. And what we're going to do now is there's been a lot of information shared. So we're going to take a break to digest a bit of this. And after that, we'll begin with our second panel. Thank you.